This week I had a great conversation about science and the actual beauty and purity of science and scientific investigation with Wallace Thornhill. Now, Wallace is the Vice President of the Thunderbolts Project. And in this, we talk about his concept around the electrical universe. What makes this conversation so much fun and really enjoyable, and it's a really delicate conversation, is that Wallace has done most of his research and journeying and investigation and exploration outside of university. And what this conversation really, I got from it, was a real sort of falling back in love with science and how we can do our own little scientific experiments, endeavors in our own garage and investigate things for ourselves rather than just leaving it to the scientists in universities with great, letters after their name. So watch this, enjoy this, and I'm really interested to see how you go with it. So enjoy Wallace.
Hello and welcome back to WA Real. I'm your host, Bryn Edwards. WA Real holds a space to follow the oldest form of learning, that of listening to the stories and the experience of those around us. Why? So we can explore these stories to find out our own truth and our own sense of self. Today, we're going to look at a completely new paradigm of how we look at the universe, and one that is approachable to all of us. We're going to do that with my guest today, Wallace Thornhill. Wallace, welcome to the show.
Thanks very much for the invitation, Bryn.
Thank you. Thank you. So before we jump into the what is the electrical universe, can you give me just a quick précis of your background, because that in and of itself is kind of interesting and raises some fun questions at the start.
Okay, yeah. Well, I was born and bred in Melbourne, went to Melbourne University and completed a degree in science and began a fourth year under Professor Victor Hopper. But it was partway through that year that I realized I had no hope of advancing in the academic world because I was asking questions that people didn't like. And so I joined IBM as a scientific programmer and then went on to become a systems engineer at the National University in Canberra. I was transferred up here way back in 1967 at the time when the moon landings and everything were happening.
So did working for IBM give the opportunity to ask those questions?
Well, I certainly interested some of the people who worked with me, and they would ask me, "Why are you here?" Yeah. I said, "Well, the work's good and the pay's good. It's very interesting." I said, "Where I was going nowhere. Nobody was interested in what I was interested in."
What was that at that stage?
Well, when I was at high school, this is back in the mid-50s, my father brought home a book. He was in and out of Heidelberg Hospital. He was a TPI pensioner. And he said, "I think you might be interested in this book." He knew I was very interested in astronomy. I used to memorize facts out of the encyclopedia and bore the kids at school witless with recitations from the encyclopedia. But it was Immanuel Velikovsky's Worlds in Collision.
Right.
It had become a bestseller for 6 months in New York, in I think the New York Times bestseller. But boy, it certainly, threw the cat amongst the pigeons for the astronomers, in particular Harlow Shapley, who was one of the leading astronomers of the day, and he became, according to Fred Hoyle, almost incoherent.
Right.
Because, of course, as I've learned over the years, our cosmology is just another form of religion. It's a creation story. It's miraculous. It has no relevance to physics at all. And of course,
it's a nice big statement.
When I found out his work, I realized later that he taught me how to do real science, and that is the old classical way, where you were trained in all sorts of things, Latin, history, and the classics, and all this kind of stuff. Nowadays, with specialization, we are more or less brought up with complete tunnel vision.
Right.
And so the experts that we have now, and we've sort of developed a cult of the expert, it's called. We sort of submit to expert opinion when in fact their opinions are often very ill-informed because they cannot see any kind of big picture. There is no university on earth that teaches the big picture where it shows how everything fits together. And as a result, the science of today is incoherent. But all of these ideas, of course, many years later came together because I just pursued my main interest, and that was to actually understand and be able to explain what Velikovsky had shown, and that is that within human memory, not in historical times, as the Worlds in Collision suggests, but within human memory, mankind has witnessed some incredible things in the sky, including planets hurling thunderbolts, as they call them, the thunderbolts of the gods.
Yeah.
And apparently the Earth was involved to the extent that it created tremendous damage on Earth and traumatized the human race, those that survived. And we still have this kind of imprinted, or what you might call a kind of instinctive, inherited post-traumatic stress disorder and a fear of doomsday.
Yes.
The end of the world. And you see it repeated all the time. And fear is one of the biggest words that you'll see used in newspapers and all that kind of thing in the media to try and drive people to do things, because it is one of the key drivers of mankind.
Yes.
Now, Carl Jung, the famous psychoanalyst, said as a result of his work, which was with thousands and thousands of psychiatric patients, that they all had these themes which kept coming through, which he called an archetypal memory.
Yes.
And the archetypes are all ones to do with this half-remembered past, which we keep suppressing. And the problem there, as Velikovsky saw it, because he was a leading psychoanalyst and polymath, you might say, because he covered the ground. He was a classical scholar.
Yes.
He identified it and said that it appears that we suffer from a kind of amnesia, the whole human race.
Yes.
And so he identified what Carl Jung had recognized and also explained it, which was phenomenal, really. And that is that we, as amnesiacs, have this subconscious memory of doomsday, the end of the world, and we'll all die, we'll all be judged, and, you know, watch out, watch out for the end of the world and the signs of its coming.
Yeah.
And the problem with that kind of amnesia is that there is a tendency on the sufferer to want to subconsciously or to revisit the events in a way which is safe. So we have all these disaster movies, and we have these monster movies, you know, with Godzilla and these creatures that are so much more powerful than us, you know, the superheroes.
All these sort of things.
Yeah, all this kind of stuff. And throughout my life, I've had a number of things which were going to be the end of the world. First of all was the nuclear winter. And then we were going to have an ice age. That was back in the 80s, I think it was. And then it was comet impact and space guard and all of these kinds of things were set up. And people have forgotten about that. And now it's global warming and the global pandemic. And this existential fear is a real problem because it, I think, is at the heart of our misunderstanding of religions. In fact, religions are not an answer to anything. They're the biggest question mark facing mankind. You know, what gave birth to them? And my colleague Dave Talbot, who was an American who I first met in 1974, and 20 years later, in 1994, after he'd published a book called The Saturn Myth, I was invited by him to come and speak at his first international meeting, where his film, Remembering the End of the World, was premiered. And he at the time felt that this, because it explains all of these subconscious memories so that you kind of identify it, and it has a huge impact on people. He thought that it would go viral. And I'm pleased that it didn't, because we were ill prepared at that stage to do anything with it.
Yes.
Anyway, after I saw his work, I went and said to him, you may not remember, we first met 20 years ago at a conference in Canada. It was the first International Velikovsky conference, and I cashed in insurance policies and everything here to go and see it. And but at that meeting, he was one of the people who was organising it, and we both talked about, all sorts of things other than cabbages and kings, instead of what was really bugging us at the time. So in 1994 in Portland, Oregon, where this conference was held, I went up to him, caught up with him in a lift, actually at the hotel, and told him we'd met 20 years earlier, and he vaguely remembered it. And I said, I've seen your work and I think we should work together.
Nice.
And that began an association that's lasted ever since. And he, when he began presenting his material after that, recognized that the common aspect between his research into the myths and legends around the world and the religions and creation myths, that the Thunderbolt was the thing that tied the two together, because my work was called The Electric Universe. In fact, the very first time I presented it was 2 years later. I camped on his office floor, and while the rain dripped outside in Portland for a month before we had our first international meeting in Portland, Oregon, 1997. So that was the start of really this whole thing. And it's been a hell of an adventure. And
yeah, it sounds it. And the most interesting thing, just before we move on any further, the interesting thing is that a lot of that was because you're deshackled from the requirements of academia in universities.
Yes, I recognise that the hostility or disinterest at the university was meant that I had no real future there. To get on there, you've got to join in and play to the same song sheet.
Mm. And I've had on the podcast previously Dr. Lynn Bailey, who was the chief scientist of Western Australia, and part of her career is thankful to a tutor who gave her the latitude to go and ask some difficult questions, but she recognised by and large you had to kowtow to get somewhere. So yeah, and likewise myself, having been to university and then wanted to go back not so long ago, and then realising, this is not necessarily the place for me, and now reading the podcast.
Yeah, that's right.
So and I think it's worthwhile just spending a second with that point, because there will be a lot of people out there who see science as a very individual focused specialist thing. Like your concept of the classical scientist who looks at all things so very widely. I think I probably resonate with that, having such a varied educational and experienced background. But then it just makes science so much more approachable to people. I feel sometimes that science has become almost like this religion in and of itself. If the high priest scientist with the PhD says, thou shalt rub this on the back of your ear, and scientists have said, then you'll go and do it. And what's the difference between that and the high priests of the Greek mythology? But if you dial back from it, science is a way of us to investigate. It's a very mind orientated game, as opposed to a whole embodying type of thing. And sometimes I just think it loses its place, but at the same time it then shuts itself off from the everyday person to investigate science by themselves, even if it's repeating an experiment in the garage that somebody's done before, just so you can actually see, feel and experience it yourself, let alone go and ask further questions.
That's right. Yes, I've found a number of people who've been inspired by what I do, who have performed their own garage experiments, and with great success. You know, they've got YouTube channels and that showing the effects of electrical scarring on planetary type surfaces. I did the first ones back in the 1990s here in Canberra. Actually, I had a high voltage engineer who became interested in what I was doing, and he had a garage with equipment that looked like that film Back to the Future, you know, with the mad scientist.
Yeah.
He had every piece of electrical equipment you could imagine. And and he had a lot of fun too, because he learned some things because I would ask questions that he hadn't thought of. And so, oh, we'll try that and see what happens.
Yeah.
And of course, this is the way that individuals contribute to science, because all the great breakthroughs have come from individuals, not from the great teams of scientists working with a multi-billion-dollar facility. It's the people who think and then try.
Yeah.
Mm.
So here's the big leading question. Tell me about the electrical universe.
Well, interestingly enough, while science has gone off with more and more complication, they introduce more and more imaginary forces and particles and whatnot to keep the story going. The electric universe was born out of the notion of classical physics, and that is one of simplification. I'm not looking to complicate things more, because that more or less establishes your priesthood. Only they understand it.
Yes.
I thought, if I can't understand it, the universe is not deliberately trying to be difficult.
I love that.
And it's we who make it so, because of our desire for control over others, control over information, all those kinds of things. I've always shared what I know, or what I think I know, at every step, simply on the basis that I'm happy to be pointed out where I've made a mistake, or there's something else I should consider, and maybe I haven't got the whole story right. And this has happened continually throughout my career, because I did recognize at that 1994 meeting that I mentioned that there was no way I could do this on my own. And having made that decision, and also the decision at that meeting was the pioneers who got me to where I was then, one had died, another one was too ill to come. And I thought, well, who else is going to do this if I don't? And
shit, it's just me.
Yeah. So I made the big decision at that meeting, and that was why I approached Dave Talbot, and I said, you and I should work together. And it's proved to be quite an amazing partnership. I haven't mentioned David Talbot and what he actually contributed, and that is that he took Velikovsky's approach to the analysis of myth and creation myths and history. And in some of the last work he did, he pointed out that, strangely enough, right around the world, all of the ancient races, the most ancient sources we have, were adamant that Saturn, the ringed planet, was a former sun.
Yeah.
It was our former sun. In fact, the words that are used for the sun, you know, Sol and Helios, the classical words for the sun, all originally applied to Saturn when we just transferred to the sun.
Yes.
Now that is a mind-blowing thing to come across.
Yes.
And it was the discoveries of David Talbot and a couple of other mytho-historians, we call them. I felt that they had sufficient evidence, and the evidence is overwhelming, that this was so, that my job then was to try and understand that scientifically. I've always done the science, you know, trying to make sense of the science. And it's in doing that I've managed to figure out how gravity works, and that there is only a single force you need to deal with in the universe, and that's the electric force.
The electric force.
Yeah, magnetism, gravity, the nuclear forces are all manifestations of the electric force. And the reason that they're different is that at different scales, the the important aspect of how matter behaves in response to the electric force will develop at the atomic level, subatomic level, the magnetic force, and at a lower level again, the gravitational force. And you can keep going down in levels, and the next one deals with the precession of Mercury's orbit, and so on. And all of this I discovered only in the last year or two matches the research of a German scientist, Wilhelm Weber, one of the top classical physicists, experimental physicists too, I should point out, not just theoretical. And he developed a more general form of Coulomb's law. You know, Coulomb's law gives you the equation that tells you the force between two charged particles.
Yes.
It's a static formula, though. The two charged particles aren't moving. What Weber did was to say, let's assume, make it general. Say the two forces are moving with respect to one another, and they're accelerating, and they are different masses, and they can be either the same charge or different charges. So, and by doing that, 40 years before the top physicists in the UK figured out how an atom was constructed, he had done it with his electrodynamic law. Instead of electrostatics, this is electrodynamics. Things are moving. Everything in the universe is moving.
Yes.
And when I recognized that, I thought we were within a hair's breadth of the electric universe right there.
Wow.
And of course, after goodness knows how many decades of research to actually come to that point where you go right back to, and you look at history, this is it, history is important. You have to know why we made the decisions we made back in, you know, at Einstein's time and other, you know, the times of other people. You have to look at the context and what was going on at the time, what these people were doing, what others thought. You can't just accept what an expert says that, you know, now hear this, you know.
Yes, as we discussed.
That's the result of a show of hands, and science isn't done democratically. You know, it's either right or it's wrong. And yet a lot of the science today, there's a lot of people with their hands up saying, hang on, I think you've got it wrong, but they're not being paid attention to. They're not allowed to publish in the big journals. They are censored. And so you've got this sort of subculture of thousands of scientists around the world who know science is in real trouble and are busily putting forward ideas. And I see a lot of them because they write to me and say, what do you think of this? But generally, the fault that all of them make is to use the same language that scientists are using now, and a lot of it is meaningless.
Yes.
It's quite amazing to understand that we have no definition for things like mass or energy, and we declare things a universal constant, like the universal constant of gravitation, when we don't know what gravity is. You know, Einstein did away with the force of gravity. Try telling that to somebody who's fallen over and hurt themselves.
And even those constants change.
And the constants aren't constant. The
I was
gravity
watching a lecture with Dr. Rupert Sheldrake.
Yes.
And he was explaining how he started getting curious about constants and how gravity changes. And it's like, well, if it's a constant, how does that happen?
That's right. They force it to be a constant by defining your standards in terms of the speed of light.
Indeed.
And this is crazy.
So if we can just take a pause there. So let me get this straight. All the forces that we're aware of, electromagnetic, nuclear, gravity, are one form of electricity or another, or one level of electricity.
They all respond, it's all the response of matter to the electric force.
Right. So there's a couple of questions that jump out there for me. First one is what is electricity then?
Well, and this is where I'm quite happy to say that at present we do not know.
Right.
For instance, they talk about the electric universe and the electrical power, which is obviously universal. And they say, where does it come from? And I say, I don't know. All we can do is say what we observe. And what we observe in the universe is that there are these electrical currents flowing all over the place. This web that they call is only possible if they are actually delineating electric currents, because gravity doesn't form strings of things, it forms clumps, you know. And with that realization, you can then you can build a whole new cosmology.
Yeah.
And the beauty of doing that is that you have now tied your cosmology to human experience, dating right back to the earliest memories of the Egyptians and you know, the earliest civilizations. The Australian Aborigines have some of the best stories around, the most accurate ones, because they remember their things in terms of song and dance and ritual, rather than words, which can be misinterpreted. And so this is real cosmology. Cosmology is often called the queen of the sciences, which means that everything has to fit underneath. But right now, the cosmologists don't pay any attention to anyone else but themselves, which means that what they say is of no use to us. You know, it's all makes a good story, a good science fiction story, but it has no actual use for us. It doesn't tell us why we're here, what life is, what our place is in the universe with respect to everything else, whether there is life in the universe and what would it be like. These questions are unanswerable with modern science. It also, because they are restricted to a gravitational cosmology, that is one which they think requires matter to attract other matter, and that's all it does. It cannot do anything else. So they're restricted to explosions to spread matter out and then collisions when it all falls back again, which is a pretty crackpot theory when you think about it. And one of the top astronomers of the 20th century, who was prevented from using telescopes once he published or tried to publish his original discoveries, pointed out that no, when you look out there, the universe is in balance. It's not expanding, which meant, as he said, that means that gravity must have a repulsive aspect to it. Otherwise, the whole thing would just collapse. It can't just sit there, you know. And of course, the scientists, the astronomer priests didn't like that one little bit because it destroyed their Big Bang story. And
everything's expanding out.
Yeah.
It's back in again.
Yeah, one of the top scientists of the time, Subramanian Chandrasekhar, scribbled across the top of Halton Arp's contribution and said, "This exceeds my imagination." Well, that's what science is all about. You know, if it exceeds your imagination, get out of the way and let the person who's imagining it have a go.
So how does this apply to the everyday person? How does the older perception of cosmology and physics affect our reality, and how does this change that? So
it has a huge impact. When you think about it, modern cosmology is a hopeless one, and I mean hopeless. Simply because it all started with the Big Bang, and then the end is if it's going to expand and accelerate expansion, it'll all end up, the lights will all wink out and it's just darkness, you know. Good night. Well, that's a hopeless cosmology. Also, it paints us as being on an isolated little ball of rock orbiting around an insignificant star in an insignificant galaxy amongst trillions of others. The sense of isolation, both in space and time, is overwhelming. Whereas the electric universe, which, as I said now, is based on Wilhelm Weber's mathematics, in that theory, and also in Coulomb's law, time isn't involved. Now that is profound. It means that Einstein's idea that you cannot transfer information at anything faster than the speed of light is nonsense. It means that we are a part of a connected, conscious universe. Now that changes everything. That means that we're a manifestation of the consciousness of the universe. And you say, well, why are we here? And you say, well, you are the self-referential part of that universe. We are able to witness, experience, and what we witness and experience is not lost because it's fed back to the universe.
Yes.
And we manifest, in my opinion, with a purpose. But it's very quickly knocked out of us when we're very little, quite often. But those people who do recognize in a child some propensity or some desire to do something often are surprised by just how amazing and successful that person can be. That child can
the
be.
purpose is what can I become?
Yeah, so if you look at your own children, and they're all different, they all came here with a different purpose, and then nurture them as a sentient being and connected to you. We're all connected. This is the other part of it.
Yes.
So this separation, the idea that we're separate and that nationalism is a good idea and all this kind of nonsense just goes out the window. And you see that if we're ever going to communicate with more intelligent life, we've got to get a whole lot more intelligent first. The other aspect of this model too is that we're wasting our time using radio telescopes to talk to highly intelligent civilizations because they wouldn't use radio.
Yes.
It'd be like using smoke signals, to intercontinental transfer of data. It just doesn't work. They're not stupid enough to use something where the fastest conversation you could have would be with a 9-year turnaround time to the nearest star.
Yes.
No. All matter in the universe is connected in real time. And this is exactly how gravity works. The Earth is responding to all the matter in the universe in real time.
So how do we speak to more intelligent?
The speed of thought. Thought is infinite speed. As you can see, this absolutely changes everything.
Yes. And more, I hear the similar sort of messages coming to me, whether it's through scientists, an open-minded scientist like yourself, or I've also had other scientists before, quantum physicist who's telling me about, particles, doesn't matter how far apart they are, they're spinning together at the same time.
Yeah, the electric universe, that's not spooky.
Yes, because with it being all connected.
Yeah.
And yet you can go into more deeper, older spiritual realms that look at the connectedness and the unity consciousness and infinite consciousness, and they all start coming together. Yeah,
all the woo-woo aspects of quantum theory are not woo-woo at all in the electric universe, because the experimenter is part of the experiment.
Yeah.
If you decide to do something in the middle of an experiment, then that will have an effect even if you think about it. Yeah. It's not spooky at all. You are connected to everything in that experiment, including the particles that you're playing with.
So so going back to the question, how does this change? It's changed everything, because we are all connected. We are all, we are all in this together.
Yes.
There is no escaping. And therefore, the ability to communicate outwards is also by going further inwards.
Yes. I think I mentioned that I wrote an article in the Secular Heretic, the Canadian journal, which has just started up. That's an arts type of journal, but I wrote it because of the title of their journal, The Secular Heretic, and here am I, a heretic in the scientific realm. And it's been interesting to see the response to that. It's been very good, simply because I've tried to paint this coherent big picture. And that's what the electric universe is. It's always been for me this huge puzzle jigsaw puzzle with all of these pieces. And so I spend more than half the day usually just reading scientific reports and checking to see whether those reports, once I've looked at it, I can fit it into the puzzle. And if I can't, then I've got more work to do. But in the last few years, the bits that don't fit have reduced to almost nothing. And the surprises that scientists are continually reporting in the science news are not a surprise to me. They just fit. I can see where they fit. And this is a good test of a cosmology. And it can be in any field. It can be in biology, chemistry, nuclear physics, anything.
So all right, I'll come back to that question in a minute. How does this link to, so we've got very much the stars, the cosmology and everything around it. We've got us as sentient beings. What about the planet as a living being?
Yeah, we're an intimate part of the Earth. This is one thing that's not considered by all of these people who are suggesting we colonize Mars and the Moon or anywhere else. We will no longer be Earthlings if we do, and so you cannot predict the consequences. I mean, you send people into space on these space station. You send them up there for months, and when they come back, they're almost crippled. They have to regenerate their bones and muscles and everything to function in our present situation. But there's far more to it than that. On a very subtle level, we are energetically a part of the Earth. So this idea that if we mess this Earth up, we can go elsewhere is nonsense. In fact, I've often thought that in a homeopathic sense, anybody who sets off for a long journey in space should have a homeopathic signal sent to them just to maintain contact with the Earth.
And the consciousness of Earth.
Yeah. Yeah, homeopathy, I mean, is a no-brainer when you understand the electric universe, and a lot of the so-called natural therapies, which are based on subtle energy, they call it. Well, it is subtle. It's very subtle. But it is nonetheless electric resonances between similar conformed molecules, biological molecules. And life itself is dependent upon instructions from beyond the body to build it. It's part of your consciousness. And so people who look at auras and all of this kind of thing can suddenly we can actually start to begin doing science on the things which at present are taboo.
Yes.
Now, no subject should be taboo unless you can critically point out the faults in it. And no scientist has been able to do that with these things. I mean, homeopathy was the major form of therapies in some European countries and still is. And some of the best work on bioenergetics in that field is being done in Germany. But this is not taught. In fact, it's taboo. And anyone who raises it at university will be the error of their ways will be pointed out in no uncertain manner. It's also rather saddening to see the kind of behaviour of governments on the advice of experts and the things they're doing, which are totally misguided. There's so much to be done. What I do is I paint the big picture. I cannot go into the finest detail because I just, one man can't do it. But I can point to things which I think will work. And I think the best example I can give is our Sapphire Experiment, which is to reproduce a star in the laboratory. And it's worked. For a few $1 million, we've done what governments have been trying to do around the world, countless billions of dollars over the years to produce fusion energy like the sun. But that's an assumption. They assume that their crackpot model is how all stars work. But it's so complicated and so unlikely. You imagine it's a kind of a version of the hydrogen bomb, which it just goes off slowly. But if that was the case, that's the most unstable system I can think of. So the night sky should look like the 4th of July with stars exploding all over the place.
Yeah.
You know, it's just it is a crackpot story, but it was made up at a time when nuclear energy had been first discovered. And the science of plasma behavior, the universe is bathed in plasma, that's charged particles and magnetic and electric fields. That science was in its infancy. It's just a poor timing. And so everyone went wild with the idea, wow, all that energy locked up in matter.
Electricity moves through.
Yeah. So it was just an unhappy coincidence that Eddington at that time jumped on the notion that the only way to keep the sun shining for billions of years was to invoke nuclear energy. And then they had the problem of, well, how do we do that? And so they then built a model which had no reference at all to what was seen in the sky. In other words, they didn't look at the granulations in any detail to see that they don't conform to convection. They didn't look at the fact that sunspots are dark, which suggests that whatever's underneath that bright outer region is cool underneath. In the electric universe model, it is cool. The stars and planets are made exactly the same way in the same process at the same time. Then they're not planets are not built from leftovers. They're all built at the same time. So a star has a planetary style interior, quite a large one, but it then has an extensive atmosphere, which may be 100,000 kilometers or several 100,000 kilometers deep. And right at the very top, in what we would call the ionosphere, is electrical activity taking place, which generates nuclear energy at the same time in a benign way, in a controlled way, one which actually has a transistor action to control the brightness of the output. That's why they shine so steadily.
Mm.
And we've reproduced it in the laboratory and shown that it works.
Wow.
Even to the point of the nuclear reactions. We've shown that the sunshine is largely, it's all happening in front of our eyes. It's transforming the lighter elements into heavier elements in what I call catalytic nuclear reactions. You don't need to smash atoms together. All you do is nuclear chemistry. Only to do nuclear chemistry, you do it in a plasma. You don't do it in a test tube.
And nobody's interested in this.
Oh yes, there are some people very interested in it.
Yes, I was going to say.
But no one is, I mean, this would have been absolute headline news if it was known and accepted generally. But we have this huge Titanic of modern science, and trying to turn that around, I think it'll have to hit the iceberg. That's all that'll stop it.
Mm.
There's so much invested in maintaining steady as she goes in big organizations, and science has become one of the biggest. No, it'll be like in the past, it requires a revolution to stop to change course.
Mm.
But of course, revolutions generally occur when people are fed up with what's going on. And people are pretty fed up with what's going on right now.
Yes. Yes. It doesn't seem like science is helping us a great deal at the moment.
Yeah.
So if somebody's intrigued by this, short of going on your YouTube channel, which has got some great movies on there to bring people in, what are sort of the top 3 or 4 things to consider which can start sparking that interest for the layperson?
I think it's a case of finding out something that is of interest to you. And with our meetings, we cover all sorts of subjects, including electric biology, and it's not all about space. We have Rupert Sheldrake has spoken at a number of our conferences going back to about 2000 or the early 2000s anyway.
Certainly the idea of morphic resonance sort of
That's
fits
right,
in.
because I picked up on his work shortly after he published that, because I realized that he was going in the same direction I was, and that was this connectedness with something beyond the body. I mean, this has been tested in laboratories and found to work, ESP, remote viewing, things like that. In fact, our Sapphire experiment, the first one we did, which was just a bell jar, just to test the concept, to make sure we could actually produce the phenomena we needed, was right next door to the Faraday cage they used for remote viewing experiments some years earlier, which proved that it works. You know, you cannot shield thought. Thought and gravity, they're the same force, actually, the same force, pass through matter, you know, through,
Yeah.
doesn't matter what it is. It's available. And this is why you can have living creatures discovered, you know, kilometers below the surface and at the bottom of the ocean deeps. They get their signals just the same as we do on the surface, because you cannot shield from it.
So we're saying, what are the first 3 or 4 things people can get their heads around?
Oh, okay. David Talbot and I wrote 2 books back quite some years ago now. The first one was called Thunderbolts of the Gods, which outlays Dave Talbot's thesis, but then sort of at the end of it hints about the electric universe model. And then we did the electric universe. We co-authored the 2 books. He was the top author in the first one. I'm the top author in the second. Now, in that first book, The Electric Universe, I pulled my punches quite a bit. I didn't want to include too much, so it's mostly about astronomy. But I'm working right now on the book which will cover the whole lot. And hopefully, you know, have it published before long. But that will chart the sequence of ideas and as they occurred and how it all fits together. You know, it's chapter and verse for people, so that when people ask me questions, which they do in large numbers, I can just refer them to, you know, have a look at chapter so-and-so. Or
So you'd be pretty empty after that.
I'm looking forward to maybe a bit of respite.
Yeah, I think, what was it you said to me yesterday when we spoke? It's the book I need to write before I die.
That's right.
It's got to come out of me. Super. What have you learned about yourself on this journey with the electric universe?
Oh, quite a few things. At some point, I recognized that my intuition was the chief guide. That I intuitively respond to something when I think it's right. And that occurred with the electric sun model when I first read it back in about 1972. And so, but then it takes me years to overcome this problem that everyone does. No, certainly all the experts can't be wrong. You know, how am I ever going to present this without looking like an idiot? And this happened, you know, when I had realized that Einstein had to go. You know, just a few small things like that. How do I explain this to people? And then that's the real problem. How do I explain this in words that the common man will understand without, you know, using a whole lot of language which is largely meaningless? I think people have recognized in me an obsession with this, but it's not an obsession so much as a realization that this is my inspiration. This is what I'm here to do. It's like somebody who realizes they would want to be a great dancer or a singer or something like that. I realized that I was on this path as a young boy before even teenage. You know, I used to ask my dad questions about why doesn't the Earth just spiral into the sun, you know, and he couldn't answer it, but it was a question, you know, that I felt needed answering. Things like that. So it's been a lifelong adventure.
There's been quite a connection with a deep sense of knowing in this.
Yes. I've been blessed with Air Force standard eyesight for most of my life, so that I needed it when I'm scanning things at high speed, because I tend to look for the headlines, and if there's something there that stands out, then I'll read further and deeper. Otherwise, I'd never get through all the material, because it can be any subject that will, something will just strike me and I think, hang on, that's interesting, I better look at that. So I'm not restricted to any one subject.
Yeah. How,
In fact,
go on.
I was just going to say that I think the best indication of that was that at university, doing a science degree, I was the only one amongst the science people who haunted the anthropology shelves of the university library. And the reason for doing that was just to check that Velikovsky hadn't cherry-picked his sources. But once I got started, I realized, no, he certainly hasn't. He could have just, he could have written 10 books and filled it with data which matched what he was saying.
How do you keep yourself grounded through all of this? Because it must get heady stuff after a while.
How do I what?
How do you keep yourself grounded?
Oh, I have a family.
Right.
I have 3 daughters, a dear wife who's stood by me in my obsessions all these years. And I've got 9 grandchildren and 1 great granddaughter. So I've got plenty of grounding.
Earthing runs.
Yeah, and earthing.
Yeah, superb. And the last question I ask all my guests on WA Real is that, and it's a hypothetical one, but I enjoy the answer from all my guests, is that if you could take one nugget of information and just load it into collective consciousness so everybody just gets it, what would that be?
That's a good question. I think the thing that is most important, and it's something that occurred to Velikovsky at the end of his life, and he talks about in Mankind in Amnesia, is that if we are to heal from our irrational behavior, we must understand our past. And there was a Canadian documentary done called The Bonds of the Past, which was recorded in 1972 by the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. And that is a very personal interview and look at Velikovsky's work. And at the end of that, he describes his fears for mankind. And he said the only way for man to have a future on this planet is to understand his past, his and her past.
Yes.
And this, I think, is critical. Once you understand our past, it is such an amazing story. There's no science fiction story ever written that can come near it. Just trying to imagine what our forebears had to put up with. You realize why they built all those weird stone structures around the world. They were shelters. In fact, the Druids knew they were shelters, but nobody's listening because they've got no context. What our forebears experienced is totally beyond our understanding because there's nothing like it today. We thought we were doomed. We'd had it. The earth was being destroyed before our very eyes, and yet we came through it. Yes. An amazing story.
Wallace, it's been absolutely riveting talking to you today. If people want to come and find out more about you and the Thunderbolts Project, where can they go?
My personal website, which is a kind of a historical repository, it shows my progress from back in 1998 or so to today. So some of the earlier articles will have errors in them, small errors. Thunderbolts.info is our main website where the public can get involved. There's a forum, there's all sorts of means of getting involved. It's a non-profit organization set up in the US. And it's got links everywhere. And the number of subscribers is in the, I forget, it was 150,000 or more at present. And our YouTube videos, I think, are over 5 million views of our videos. Some of them feature length.
Yeah.
And the works of Dave Talbot, his series of videos paint the picture of what the ancients went through.
Superb. Plenty of stuff to go and dive into there then.
Oh yes, yes. You get lost, I'm afraid. We need a roadmap.
There you go. Wallace, thank you very much for your time.
Thanks, Bryn, for the opportunity.
Cheers.